Hi there. What do you need to know to get the most out of V for Vendetta? When we look at the first two pages, we see the main themes of the book laid out for us to examine, and this can help us get a feel for what we should look for as the book progresses. The illustration before the action really starts, on page 7, is of a gloved hand placing a domino into a line of dominoes. What does this mean? It appears to be a hint there's a chain of events planned. After all, isn't that what a line of dominoes means? It's a children's game in which one carefully lays out a series of dominoes, creating a causal chain to unfold as each domino topples the next. This can be a simple chain in which a small number of dominoes are used, or it can be a large, flashy chain and with thousands of dominoes. Which it will be in this story remains to be seen. On the first page of action, we open with 5 panels that set the feel for the book. It's dark. We see people leaving a factory that has barbed wire around it. There are surveillance cameras on light posts marked "For Your Protection." We see police in the street stopping traffic. Then we move on to the 2 leads in the book, Evie Hammond and V. We see Evie first. She's in a disheveled flat, putting on makeup. In the corner of a panel sits her teddy bear, indicating her youth and innocence. Then we see V walking into an elaborately decorated room, the walls covered in posters from the golden age of cinema. James Cagney, Bob Hope, Bing Crosby, Dorothy Lamour, Bela Lugosi, a combination of comedies, horror movies, and gangster films. This lays out what V's personality will be like, don't you think? V is an actor. V is also an intellectual, though. Look at the bookcase on the last panel on page 9. We see there books by Hitler, by Marx. We see Uncle Tom's Cabin. We see Thomas More's Utopia. These are all books about changing the world, key texts likely to be found in courses on the history of the West. They prescribe changing the world in different ways, though. I think we'll find as we go along that none of them are quite what V wants to have happen. On the second page, we found out why Evie has been putting on makeup. She's a 16-year-old girl who works in a munitions factory and can't make enough money to get by. In her innocence, she's decided to become a freelance prostitute, but her very first foray into prostitution ends when she solicits a policeman on a vice detail. It's in this interaction that we get a sense of what the government of England is like in this alternate 1997. The policemen are called fingermen, and they work for a kind of political police, not regular police. They aren't bound by the normal rules. They get to decide how to punish criminals when they find them, and in this case, they plan to rape Evie and then kill her. So ask yourself, what kind of government puts together a vice squad that gets to punish a first-time offender with gang rape and then death? That's the government that V sets out to change. Now we meet V, and here we have to take our first detour. This graphic novel was written as a series of comic books for a British magazine in the mid-1980s and was first published in part during 1985. The audience for it was entirely British. We have to be sensitive to that context, the where and when of its publication, in order to understand who V is and why V dresses the way V does in the first chapter. V would be instantly recognizable to a British audience, as V wears the distinctive costume of Guy Fawkes, a celebrated villain in British history. Guy Fawkes was a terrorist. He was part of a plot in 1605 to blow up the entire government of England, the 2 houses of Parliament and the king, as well as the heir to the throne and most of the king's family and supporters. The plan was to detonate a huge bomb that would kill everyone at the state opening of Parliament. After that, the terrorists meant to lead an uprising of Catholics against the Protestants who ran England at the time. Their goal was to put a Catholic ruler on the throne and stamp out Protestantism. The best analog for Americans trying to understand what Guy Fawkes meant in Britain in 1985 might well be Osama bin Laden. Try to imagine a comic book being published in which the hero was someone who put on an Osama bin Laden costume and ran around blowing up government buildings. Now, Guy Fawkes failed to blow up Parliament in 1605. He was caught. And the day on which his gunpowder plot was thwarted, the 5th of November, became a holiday. It's traditionally celebrated with great bonfires, fireworks, the burning of an effigy of Guy Fawkes, and in times gone by an effigy of the Pope as well, since Guy Fawkes was a Catholic. End detour, back to the action. On pages 13 and 14, we see V take Evie, whom he has rescued from the fingerman, to a rooftop to enjoy a show. Parliament Hall blows up, and fireworks put a colossal V into the air to demonstrate that the demolition of Parliament Hall was no accident. For Americans, Parliament Hall, the palace at Westminster, means little more than the tower in which Big Ben rests, clanging out the hours. In Britain, though, Parliament Hall is the site of political sovereignty. The king in Parliament is sovereign in Britain and can make the law. By destroying that site, V indicates there is no longer a sovereign in Britain. It is an attack on the legitimacy of the government. On the following pages, we are introduced to that government, the one behind the surveillance cameras and the fingermen. This is the place for our second detour, as we find that the government is not referred to by names that we instantly recognize. There's no Federal Bureau of Investigation, there's no Department of Agriculture, no press secretary. Instead, the government uses an old-fashioned metaphor for the state, one dating from the Middle Ages. They refer to the state as a body. In the Middle Ages and the early modern period, one found in Europe the common notion that a kingdom was a body, and the central idea was that the king himself had two bodies. One was his personal body, subject to mortal death and decay. The second body was an eternal one, the kingdom itself. The king was figured as the head of state, with his nobles acting as his arms and hands, his clergy as the heart, his peasants acting as the legs. This metaphor was meant to keep people in their places as much as anything else, as it would be silly for the hands to think they could take over for the brain, or the feet to think that they could act as hands. Thus we find the head, which is the new government. The eye runs visual surveillance, the ear listens to what people are saying, the nose is the regular police bureau set to sniff out the perpetrators of crime. The finger is the enforcement arm, the political police meant to punish and coerce. The mouth, seen on page 16, is the propaganda bureau, meant to manipulate public opinion. In chapter 2, we learn more about the mysterious voice of fate. It was with the voice of fate that the book began, an all-knowing voice on the radio that gave the news and the weather, and it is, by the way, in the book, never wrong about the weather. This fate, as we will later see, is a massive supercomputer that keeps track of everything happening in Britain and advises the leader, who relies on it completely. End the detour back to the action. In chapter 2, we learn that the voice of fate is Louis Prothero, a former actor and Norsefire party activist who was rewarded for his loyalty to the party with leadership of a death camp called Larkhill. We learned about Norsefire in chapter 3 when we read Evie's story. The death camp at Larkhill turns out to be a central location for the rest of the book. We see it in flashbacks, we see it recreated, we see it in the present. We meet people who worked at the camp. We watch V drive them mad, we watch V kill them. What happened at Larkhill? I think it's safe to say that this question is the driving question of the book. What happened at Larkhill set the whole series of dominoes in motion. In the book, we are shown V as the mastermind behind an elaborate revenge plot, very much the Vendetta mentioned in the book's title. V did not, however, start the plot in motion. What happened at Larkhill set the plot in motion. So, be on the lookout for Larkhill and what happened there. In chapter 4, we see that V has reconstructed Larkhill in his basement. He takes Prothero to the basement. He torments the voice of fate and deliberately drives him insane. When he returns Prothero to London, Prothero is wearing the makeup of one of his beloved dolls and can say nothing more than Mama. This is only the first act. What will happen next? Oh, by the way, the first words we hear V speak are all in quotation marks. V is quoting from Shakespeare's Macbeth, and in the third person at that, describing the rescue of Evie Hammond from the fingerman as if it were part of a play. The implication is that V stars as Macbeth in this production and has just come onto the stage. Now, I want you to think, how do things end up for Macbeth in that famous play? All right, read some more of the book and then come back for part 2 of this talk.